So it's my pleasure to introduce Miguel Centeno, who's a professor and also the department chair in sociology and also international affairs here at Princeton. For many years, he was the director of the Princeton Institute for International and Regional Studies, and he's done a lot of work on global issues, land tenure, various things that actually have nothing to do with this particular conference. So you're probably wondering why I asked Miguel to actually moderate this particular panel on robustness. Well, recently Miguel's been standing up a center here at Princeton on global systemic risk, which basically looks at broadly risk in complex systems and how the interaction between various modules in complex systems can lead to risk. And one of the examples he points to are things like the global financial crisis and things of that nature. So he's not just looking at technological systems, but also organizations as well. But I think he can certainly talk a little bit more about this. But I was really interested to get his perspective when we're talking about robustness in IoT, because obviously IoT is another very complex system with many, many moving parts and modules, and obviously lots of risks here as well. So without further ado, I'll introduce Miguel as our moderator for the final panel on robustness and security.
Thanks, Nick, and hello. I am not an expert on computers, so if you ask questions, if I fail to summarize them correctly, please excuse my ignorance. I am a user. I have no idea what's going on inside the black box. Just 2 points. One, on the personal level, I'm a Luddite. So you will not, I would not get one of these refrigerators in my house. I don't care what it did. I think this is one of the most dangerous things we've ever come up with. I'm just putting out my biases to begin with. The second issue, and I've looked at the work of several of the panelists and what's been discussed about this, and it seems that there's a lot of attention paid to the individual, protecting the individual's privacy, protecting the service to the individual. I'm more concerned with the systemic process, whether even as we guarantee each individual their privacy, even as we guarantee each individual access to this, the very possibility of interaction between all these devices, between all these connections, creates a whole set of dangers that cannot be addressed simply by looking at individuals. So the perfect example of that is the banking crisis. A lot of banking regulation is about malfeasance and stupidity at the level of the individual bank. There's actually very little done about the banking system itself. And that actually is one source of great fragility, and I expect it will be the same thing in the IoT. With that, let me just introduce, I have no biographical details, so I won't bore you with lots of stuff, but we're going to speak in the order in which I was given. And the first speaker is Vyas Sikot from CMU.
Cool. Hey, thanks, Megan. Oh. Okay. Thanks for the introduction. So I'm Vyas. I'm from CMU. I work in networking and security. So actually, is it on?
You just have to get closer.
Okay. All right. Is it fine now? All right. Thank you. So I work at the intersection of networking and security. And I've been spending some time thinking about IoT risks and robustness in IoT and so on. Actually, to Miguel's point, it's not just the Luddites who would avoid these things in their homes. It's also the people who actually know the technology would also avoid this in their homes. So there's the two extremes that will avoid them. So I think there's sort of risk on both sides. So one thing we've actually been thinking about, sort of from this notion of robustness and risks in IoT, is trying to understand what is this. I mean, we've had cybersecurity issues in the enterprise landscape, in the IT landscape for the longest time. So one question that sort of has been bugging us from a technology point of view is how exactly is IoT different, right? So what makes IoT different? If we have failed sort of catastrophically in the IT world, what makes it different? Or if we have solutions from the IT world, how can we adopt them in the IoT world? So we've actually been thinking a little bit about it, and as somebody else mentioned, we have more questions than answers at this point. But it does look like something that's going to be sort of different in the IoT landscape. Is actually we're going to have this proliferation of devices that are actually going to have what I would call unfixable flaws, right? So you have these device manufacturers who are spending $1 a pop on building these devices, unleashing them on the marketplace, and these devices and sensors may be out in the world for 10, 15 years, or God knows how long. And these guys have actually no incentive to bake in security or the technological know-how to build in security from the ground up into these devices. So these devices already ship with very, very poor management APIs. They're hard to manage, they're hard to update. They may not have an operating system, they may not have anything like software that we know how to deal with, and so on. So we have to live with this reality of devices that are out in the field that will have fundamentally unfixable vulnerabilities. Not only that, these devices may have like resource constraints in the sense that the hardware may not support the latest and greatest crypto. The hardware may have baked in keys and passwords that we cannot change once they're out there in deployment. So that's also sort of a constraint we need to live with. And finally, there's this sort of interesting interaction between devices and between the devices and the environment that we don't quite understand, right? So how do these cyber physical dependencies between devices and the environment, across devices, how this sort of system interacts with the environment is also something we don't understand. And to make all of these things worse, we're going to live in this world where it's going to be a very, very, very diverse marketplace, right? In the IT landscape, okay, it's already pretty diverse, but you can think about there's probably like 3 operating systems in the or 2 depending on who you talk to. In the mobile world, there's 2. In the enterprise world, there's 3. So it's a pretty manageable problem. In the IoT world, first of all, there may not be an operating system, and even if there are, we're already seeing this sort of very fragmented marketplace. So that's sort of the problem on why IoT is different. And this actually has like sort of key implications on how we build any robust and secure IoT infrastructure. And in particular, sort of one taxonomy or framework to think about any robustly secure system is that any security system really has 3 components. So one is actually an enforcement mechanism that says, that sort of gives you a hook or a vantage point at which to implement your security and robustness policies. The second component is actually the policy abstractions that feed in to this enforcement mechanism. And finally, we actually need some kind of a learning component or a modeling component that feeds into these policies to say, okay, how would the system behave if X, Y, and Z happened? What could be the cascading effects if this sensor turned on and started opening the door, and then the door opened something else, and so on and so forth. So essentially, we need these sort of 3 components, learning, policy, and enforcement. And this combination of factors, unfixable flaws, constraints on devices, the cross-device and environment interactions, and the diversity of the landscape has like sort of fundamental implications for all 3 components of security in terms of learning, in terms of policy, in terms of enforcement. So for example, one thing we've sort of starting to believe in the enterprise world or in the IT world is this notion of putting security in the endpoints, putting security in the host, and so on. That's not a paradigm that's going to work in the IoT world, because you have these devices which are unfixable, and these devices that are fundamentally flawed, and the devices that are going to have like resource constraints where they may not be able to run your software or your updates or patches and so on. So that has key implications for enforcement. Similarly, in terms of like learning, so how do we sort of learn what's good and what's abnormal today is largely through some very simple crowdsourcing mechanisms, or run like some decoys or honeypots out in the wild, wait for attackers to attack them, then you say, oh, I've learned a signature of what's bad. That's not going to work when you have like millions of different vendors and different devices. And not just that, how devices interact with one another may critically depend on the particular environment they are in, right? So the location matters, the sphere of influence matters, right? How 2 sensors and actuators behave in this room might be very different from how they act in the football field. So again, there are going to be very diverse deployments that affect how these things may interact, and that may in fact affect your threat model and the adversary as well. So this sort of, as I said, I have like more questions than I have answers. So this is sort of the setting we are in right now, that this combination of factors is going to fundamentally change how we think about implementing a robust and secure architecture for systems of these IoT devices. So my particular stance, again, this is something, again, since I come from the networking world, I naturally believe the network has to step up in a particularly big way. Cisco may agree with me. So, so the network really has to fundamentally step up. And the reason really is this fact that the endpoints cannot do anything, or you cannot trust the endpoints anymore. So the network really needs to be able to step up in a particularly big way. And in particular, we actually need to think about sort of pragmatic solutions that can be like bolted on to legacy and existing deployments, rather than wait for the device vendors to come up and build secure from the ground up solutions. I mean, that's nice, that's utopian, that's like ideal. That's not going to happen. We need sort of a pragmatic path to working with devices that already have flaws and are already being deployed and so on. So, so as part of that, and there's work going on at CMU, there's work going on at Princeton, looking at sort of leveraging new developments in networking, like software-defined networks and network function virtualization, which essentially give you more hooks and more technologies to develop and customize security solutions for IoT. And that, I think, is a promising way forward, or at least a pragmatic way forward, to build a robust and secure IoT for the future. So I'm a networking guy. I'm going to believe the network will fix your problems. So that's my stance.
Thank you. Okay, Keith Winstein from Stanford.
Let me plug in right here. So I'm also a networking guy.
Yeah.
I'm going to echo almost everything Vyas said. I'm a networking guy, but I don't believe anything will fix your problems. It's the one area where we disagree.
Not even the network?
Well,
The network is the problem.
So Miguel asked me, as a sociologist, how would I reason about robustness in the IoT? So I think it's important to talk about sort of robustness in the large, like a systemic kind of question, and in the small, like in your own house. I think these are maybe separate questions. So I'm here from Stanford. The Internet of Things has gone through several sort of revisions. Version 1, you may recall, everyone just wanted to attach everything that they had to the Internet. It was like a fun thing to do. So there was Stanford had a vending machine, the prancing pony, on the Internet in the 1970s, and MIT had this Coke machine on the Internet. Nick, did you ever use that Coke machine? Yeah, so I was briefly the maintainer of one of the first Coke machines on the Internet. And there, you could get currency and hot tubs and elevators. These were sort of the first Internet things. Just put everything on the Internet. That was the sort of 1970s view. We seem to have come back to that. Then there was sort of version 2 of the Internet of Things. People may remember this term Internet of Things comes from the 90s. And the idea was, let's give everything in the real world a radio tag, an RFID tag. People remember those? That was sort of version 2 of the Internet of Things. That's where the term comes from. And I was at MIT for a long time, and we got these radio tags on all the buildings. You could authenticate to the building with a radio ID. You could tap it. This is a system from Motorola. And I remember when the Motorola sold it to the university, they said it had end-to-end encryption. There was a challenge response system. This is what the vendor told us. And we were a bunch of ankle biters, and we snuck out at 4 in the morning to try and investigate what was happening. And it turns out these vendor claims, even from a legitimate American company, they were just totally not true. So it turns out if you sneak out at 4 in the morning with an oscilloscope and you hook it up to the reader, you can get a signal. And if you replay that signal, you can get a door to open. So this was actually very useful to us because we had a fellow in our building, Richard Stallman, who is quite a privacy freak, and he refused to have his movements tracked. So we built him a fake card, which I have right here, that has 4 IDs in it. It had Hal Abelson and Jerry Sussman and me. I put myself among them, these numerically. And when Richard hits the button, it randomly transmits one of our IDs and opens the door. So that's how he got into the building. But this is a bunch of undergraduate ankle biters, 2005, up against Motorola. So, I'm not like a Russian spy. I'm just like some computer scientist. We totally broke the system. So that's sort of, to me, how I see IoT security. If I can break it as an undergrad ankle biter programmer, up against Vladimir Putin, I don't think we have a chance. So this was our first system that we built for Richard. He lost this one, and then we built the miniaturized version. So meanwhile, the Internet has exploded, and we started to believe this truism. There was the first Patch Tuesday was in 2003. We started to just believe, and I kind of heard this earlier, anything connected to the Internet needs to be patched regularly to patch bugs, or it becomes vulnerable to vandals who will break in and commandeer it. Now, who believes this truism? Yeah. It's truism. It's true-ish. The problem is that if we put our faith in patches for the manufacturer, we're sunk. It's going to be Russian invasion. Because the patches, you can't depend on them. I'll talk about why. Everyone promises these patches. There was a problem with the Android market. The Android's a big market. The cell phones cost $500. People weren't getting patches. So Google partnered with all these companies that they would promise to give us patches. And what happened? Google's Android update alliance is already dead. It lasted like 3 months. This is Google, the second largest company in the world. And now Android users outraged over Motorola's broken promise. Motorola was a subsidiary of Google at this time, and they're even saying, forget it, Google, we're not going to give patches. So the idea that we're going to get patches at all, much less patches that will actually fix our problems, I think is just hopeless. So now we're on to Internet of Things version 3. We got these nice thermostats, also from Google. I don't mean to pick on Google, they're just very big. We got these thermostats. So look, we know empirically, if you make a $500 cell phone, you will lose interest in supporting that and in releasing patches for it in about 6 months. So if you're talking about a $50 device or a $5 device, by the law of linearity, which is a true thing, you will never get any patches. And I think empirically how many patches have you gotten for your fork? Probably not. So I think this is actually a true rule. And yet, we're going to have these things in our houses for much longer than a cell phone. We're not talking about a cell phone that you have for 2 years. Your fork. I still have the same forks I had when I was a toddler. So I think we're in big trouble. So robustness in the large, from a societal perspective, I think allowing any one of these devices, and not just devices, any one of these software stacks or components to become too popular creates a real systemic risk. Because if someone finds a problem in it could be a particular brand device, but also a particular software component that everyone uses, like OpenSSL, hypothetically. That creates a systemic risk that can cut across the millions or billions of devices that use them. And finding, that a certain brand of light bulb or camera can be commandeered to flood, politically unfriendly speech off the internet. That was science fiction a month ago. Now it's true. That's kind of the world we're living in. So this risk of a monoculture is a real risk. And I heard Vyas saying it's very manageable when you have only 2 or 3 companies. Yeah, it's manageable for us, but also for our adversaries. Because you tag one company, suddenly you get hundreds of millions of commandeered devices. So we also talk about, sort of in the abstract, we have devices talking to the cloud. But in practice, I think it's usually it's a device manufactured by a company talking to a server manufactured or under the control of that company. This is kind of what the IoT really looks like. It's not an inchoate cloud. It's some computer that's controlled by Alphabet, big company, or it could be a watch controlled by Apple talking to a computer controlled by Apple. It could be a car controlled by Tesla talking to a computer controlled by Tesla. I saw today Tesla has said you will not be allowed to use their self-driving cars. They'll sell you a self-driving car, but you won't be able to use it to drive for Uber. Can only drive for Tesla's competing service. So, it's like you're not going to buy the car anymore. It could be some random manufacturer that's barely in business talking to their server. Good luck getting patches on that. It could be a voting machine talking to whoever's at the other end of the connection. And I remember 10 or 12 years ago when these electronic voting machines started, all the, graybeards like me, were like, this is crazy. Well, it was crazy. Now that we have a nation state that is literally trying to corrupt our electoral process, they're up against, it's crazy. So in the meantime, the idea that we're going to have norms or standards that we're going to enforce on the manufacturers and trust them, I just think empirically we can't do. Companies lie. We have to be able to check the company. So here's poor Google again. They say Safari is set by default to block third-party cookies. If you haven't changed these settings, you will block the cookies. You'll have effectively opted out of this Google tracking. That's what Google said. Well, it wasn't true. In fact, one of our students and one of Princeton's former students, Jonathan Meyer, discovered that Google was just lying. It's not true. They had found a security hole in Safari, and Google exploited it to be able to track these people anyway. And it made the Wall Street Journal, and Google's had to pay like $35 million in penalties. If you talk to your friends at Google about this, they will not have heard about it. This is not a big deal among people at Google. It's only $35 million. They make that in about 5 seconds. But trusting companies themselves to patch or to do what they say they do, we can't trust them. We need to audit them. So the problem is that these ankle biters, the Jonathan Mayers of the world, people expect, there's going to be a CVE, people will discover these security holes. Well, the security holes don't get discovered by magic. They get discovered by real ankle biters. But to do that, you have to be able to figure out what the devices are sending or receiving. You have to be able to find security holes. And that's not necessarily always the case. So in the past, you used to be able to eavesdrop on what your web browser was sending the world. You could eavesdrop on what your cell phone was sending the world. But these Internet of Things devices, there is no way to eavesdrop on what they're telling the cloud. So this toaster, it could be talking to its manufacturer and wherever. There's no way to say what it's saying about you. And in fact, Android, starting in version 7.0, which is just coming out literally this month, they've changed the policy, actually, so you can no longer eavesdrop necessarily in what your Android apps are sending to the cloud. That's a new change. You can't add a root CA certificate. So what does this mean? It means we suddenly have to depend entirely on the manufacturer, that they're telling the truth, that they keep these devices patched. We can't actually eavesdrop on our own devices anymore. We don't know what they're saying about us. And the idea that the patches are going to save us, there's this whole hierarchy. You know, there's the bugs that are in the product, and then of those, the ones that someone has discovered, and of those, someone has nicely told the manufacturer about. You know, now why would, if you discover a bug and some government is willing to pay you $1 million for that information, why would you tell the manufacturer? Well, maybe if the manufacturer is going to pay you $2 million, but you know, that just, it's not necessarily true that the manufacturers know about these bugs. And then it has to be fixed, and you have to actually get the fix. So there's a very treacherous path that a fix has to go through before you actually get it. So I think depending on patches is hopeless, depending on the manufacturer is hopeless, depending on any sort of certification that would apply at the time of sale, like an underwriter's laboratories, is hopeless, because you won't know the problems at that time. You know, we don't know at the time you're selling the light bulb what the safety standards should be. So a UL model is good, but it needs to be sort of an ongoing process. The problem with this end-to-end security, we love end-to-end security, but what this means when devices are talking securely to the endpoint is that nothing can get in the middle. No firewall, no intrusion detection system, nothing. And that means every device needs to be the bulwark of its own security. And I think depending on an individual device to be the bulwark of its own security, that's you know, when the device costs $3, that's how your car, you know, drives off the cliff. Well, actually not car drives off the cliff, but it's how, so I've had this slide in my deck for like 18 months, and this one actually came true, the light bulb botnet. I mean, that really happened. So number 2 is you're going to have a smart fridge with this is my parade of horribles, a smart fridge with a barcode scanner that tells you what you need to reorder. You know, you're out of milk, you're out of orange juice. Well, if you have HIV, you put your highly active antiretrovirals in the fridge, as you do, suddenly the fridge manufacturer has a database on everyone with HIV. This is not a good situation to be in. Or what about for control? Someone hacks the mammography equipment so that 1 in 1,000 times it gives you a deadly zap. You know, what is that going to do to healthcare? If there's a fear that, holy cow, I go to get my regular mammogram, but I might get killed by some Russian hacker or some, 400-pound person in their bed, whoever it is, this is not good, and this will happen. I really fear that this will happen. So our view is that we need layers of security. We can't just depend on the device. We can't have end-to-end security. We need layers of security, watchers watching watchers, so that you could have a market for intrusion detection systems that would inspect and audit and interdict the communications from the device. You can't just depend on the device. You can't depend on any one watcher. So our models, you have the device, you have your Linksys, you have the cloud. You want to monitor to make sure that what's being sent is kosher. It doesn't need to change the communication, just sees it. But not just one monitor, because why would you trust that too? We want a whole bunch of monitors watching each other. This is the only way I think it's going to work. So here's our scheme that we proposed is, look, I should be able to tell Google, hey, you know what? My auditor wants to inspect the last few minutes of traffic. So Google then rotates the key on the connection from the thermostat to Google. And once that's completed, the thermostat shares the old superseded key with me, with the auditor. And then I get to read the recent history of the ciphertext, turn it into plain text. So that's our proposal. There should be sort of walk-in auditing. They don't know I'm going to do it. I walk in, I say, I want to see the books. They say, OK, let us change the password on the new stuff so you can't muck with anything. But then you'll get to see the password for the old stuff. Is that kind of clear what we're talking about? It's read-only auditing. So that's our proposal. And the difficulty is this bold part, the after the rotation is complete. Because the cryptographers have a concept called perfect forward secrecy. And unfortunately, although it's perfect, you don't get this property. Because perfect forward secrecy actually just means what I'm calling level 1 here. It means the thermostat can say, please delete the keys. That's it. That's perfect forward secrecy. It would be very nice to have this level 2 where you say, please delete the keys, and the other side says, OK, I deleted the keys. But we don't have that. In TLS, when you have a forward secure cipher mode, you don't get that. You don't get that with a key update. You just don't get that. It would be very nice to have level 3, but we proposed to the IETF to go from level 1 to level 2 in TLS. So when you do a key update, they would say, OK, I deleted the keys. So we could do this. And here's what happened at the IETF. This was just a few months ago. This is the big boss of security for the entire IETF. So there's me, there's the editor of the new TLS draft, there's the chairs of the TLS working group, and then there's Stephen Farrell. He's the area director for security. And he says, I'm scared, because if you did this, you could audit. And then the scope of the auditor being an attacker is too scary to consider standardizing this. And any idea that it involve informed consent of someone seems to me fictional. I'm opposed. So it doesn't happen. This is kind of how we think about security. We really believe in end-to-end security. the result is everything depends on the endpoint. And the endpoint costs $3 and it's made by a company that went out of business 6 months ago and is in a nation, adverse to us. So in the large, I think we got to have more diversity. We can't have a monoculture. And in the small, I think we need to be able to have layers of security, layers of eavesdropping, so that ankle biters, people like Jonathan Mayer, or the undergrads, can snoop on what their own devices are saying and tell the rest of us.
Next is Elisa Cooper from Cisco.
Still work?
Maybe. Ellie, my card no longer works down the Teams. One out of 4 times it won't work.
I was just waiting for you to say that you're going to make the IoT great again. But then I got to say it, so that's even better. So I'm Alyssa Cooper. I work at Cisco. And as much as Stephen Farrell is the big boss of security in the IETF, I'm actually the big boss of applications in real time. And as you were talking, literally the minute you said auditor, I'm not familiar with the TLS work, the specific work, but I was literally thinking, like, how do we authenticate that auditor? Who is that auditor? Why would we trust that auditor? So clearly I've spent too much time with Stephen Farrell. So I work at Cisco, and I do basically 2 different things. Half of my job is I work in our collaboration business, which sells voice, video conferencing, web conferencing, persistent messaging. So if you go back to your office and you look at your phone on your desk, if you still have a phone on your desk, it probably is a Cisco phone. It's a good likelihood. So that's the part of the business that I work in, and I spend a lot of time with our hundreds of engineers thinking about the privacy design of our products, building in privacy features, and thinking about the privacy properties of the products. And the other half of my time I spend on standards activities. I've actually spent a good amount of time thinking about device identity in standards and what does that mean for privacy and tracking and correlation over time. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about those 2 things today and how they relate back to IoT and privacy. And in particular, I also hate the term IoT, which is why I've minimized the things and like to think more about everything we know about internet engineering and how it can be applied. I really don't like the way that the term IoT makes us think about it as a separate thing, as if it's this network over there and that network over there, because really they're extremely interconnected, and we know a lot from our 30, 40 years of internet engineering that we can apply to this problem space as well. So today I'm going to talk about 3 things, something to be optimistic about, something to be pessimistic about, and then a little bit of food for thought given that we're here on the last panel. So something to be optimistic about, and this has to do, again, with standards and the building blocks that we have for engineering on the internet. If you look at your devices, most of the devices that everyone has in the room with them today, at least laptops and cell phones and so forth, they have a device identifier at the data link layer called a MAC address. Most people are probably familiar with their MAC address. It's a persistent device identifier that often has been assigned by the manufacturer for your network interface card. And for a long time, we treated these device identifiers as just that, as persistent over time for the entire lifetime of the device. And this is problematic, as Ajay mentioned this morning, because this identifier gets advertised all over the place when you're searching for Wi-Fi, it gets embedded in your IP address, it goes out all over the internet, and then it can be used to track your activities. Famously, the Canadian government put Wi-Fi scanners in trash cans, and we're scanning that way to try and track people's activity. As a persistent identifier, it's been used in many different ways to invade people's privacy. So that's how things were designed originally, and that's how MAC addresses have been used for a long time. But in recent years, there's been some innovation in this space, and many different companies have started randomizing the MAC address and rotating it with some frequency. So now if you have an iOS device, you have an Android device, you have a Windows machine, all of them are randomizing your MAC address for you such that it's no longer a persistent identifier that can be used over time to track you. Similarly, if you look into the IoT space, you find things like Bluetooth LE, which has similar very nice privacy features where the device identifier that gets advertised changes over time, also uses different addresses for when you actually pair versus when you're just scanning around looking to pair. So again, it severs that link between the different identifiers over time so that you can't be tracked. At the same time, as those things aren't, well, Bluetooth is not really a standard because it's proprietary, those things aren't standardized, but if you go to the IEEE, which is the standards organization that creates the wireless networking protocols and the link layer protocols, they have a whole effort stood up to think about the privacy of the protocols that they produce and potentially to produce standardized versions that have the nicer privacy features. And so this, I think, is something to be optimistic about as we think about IoT. There's like a million problems that we could think about, and we've heard many of them today. But the way that you build a solution to a privacy problem is piece by piece. It's not by boiling the ocean. Certainly, if we had privacy at the link layer for all IoT devices, there would still be lots of other ways that you could use them to invade people's privacy, to identify the users of the devices. But if you don't solve the problem at every layer of the stack, then you're never going to solve the whole problem. It sort of drives down towards the weakest link. So I think this is something, it's just an industry trend that I think it's something to be optimistic about as we think about different kinds of devices joining the network. Now, something to be pessimistic about. So we've heard a little bit today, actually not as much as I would have expected, but we did hear it more this morning about what I would consider kind of typical hand-wringing around the lack of user interfaces and opportunities to provide notice as people interact with different kinds of smart devices. But when I think about that, it really causes me to take a step back and think about the user interfaces that we already do have in products that are deployed, or even where we have larger screens, bigger form factors, and think about how inadequate those interfaces are for expressing the properties of the systems that users are engaging with and for providing them with choices. And so I wanted to give an example from our own product line at Cisco. So at Cisco, in my business, we sell lots of different things. We sell something we call telepresence, which is basically video conferencing units. You have some that stand on the floor in a meeting room. You have some that sit on your desk. So that's one product line that we have. We also sell, as I said, messaging and chat applications. So this is an application called Cisco Spark. It runs on your mobile phone, on your desktop, on your web browser, and it allows you to chat with other people who you work with and make phone calls, make video calls, and the like. And recently, we introduced a technology in this product line, which I, even as a sort of technology skeptic, find to be like truly just magical. This is a divine experience for anyone who spends a lot of time joining video conferences in their job, which I do like every day of my life. So the way that this works is that, or the idea, the motivation for it is that if you have your phone in your pocket or in your hand or on your person, and you walk into a room that has one of our video conferencing units in it, your phone and that device will automatically pair. So you can walk into the room, and instead of doing this thing that I just did where I had to like plug in my laptop and you like, is it really going to project? Is it not going to project? You just pair automatically. You can immediately start sharing your content, sharing your slides onto the video unit. You could immediately join a video conference if there was a video conference ongoing in that room. And it basically does that using that Cisco Spark app for the pairing. So how does this work? The way that this works is that the telepresence unit is actually emitting a signature via ultrasound audio. So it's emitting the signature, and the client is listening to pick up the signature. So it's when you walk into the room, it listens at that ultrasound frequency, finds the signature using only local audio processing on your device. If it finds a match, then it pairs and deletes whatever audio it had in memory from having done the matching, and then you're paired. And it's like really a divine experience. So what's the problem with this? The problem with this is that in order to make that work, we have to activate the microphone on your iPhone or your Android phone anytime you're using the Spark application, because that's the only way that it can be listening for this ultrasound frequency. And in the future, when we do this on desktops, it's will be basically the same deal with your webcam or with the microphone on your desktop or your laptop. And what that means is that we're basically boxed in by the user interface that is provided by whatever that platform is. And so on iOS, that means you see that red banner at the top of your phone. If anybody uses like Shazam or any other application that requires the microphone to be on, you get this big red banner that's like, hey, the microphone is on, right? But in this case, it's like we're listening for a frequency that the human ear cannot hear. We're never sending anything back to the cloud. We're doing only local processing. We're not storing any of the audio, right? And so this interface gives you like is very scary as compared to what the product is actually doing. And the interface provides no way for us to sort of tell you that it's not as scary as it seems, or kind of talk you back off the ledge, like, oh, how can I turn this off, right? Same thing if your webcam light just suddenly came on, right? That would be like, oh, what is going on with that, right? But it turns out that there's nothing really nefarious going on, but the interface doesn't really provide you with a way to differentiate. And so, and if we did try to actually provide, more nuance and like give you this big explanation of it, it would kill that delight factor, right? The whole that great thing about just walking into the room and having it work. It would be completely crushed by this like wall of text to explain to you, like, actually, we're not really spying on you, right? So this is a case where we're using sensors, right? A sort of IoT relevant case. But and we have real estate we can use, and we have potential for user interface. But there's the challenge is really in explaining like the nuance of what's going on behind the product, and that I think is something that we haven't even really solved when we do have lots of user interface capability. So just a couple things in terms of food for thought. We talked earlier in the morning about kind of the policy landscape. And one thing that I would say about making policy in general is that broad definitions make really bad policy. That's one of the other reasons why I hate the term IoT, right? If you want to go, like, if the FTC, I'm saying the FTC is on my panel now, so I get to say this. If you look back, like when the FTC sat down to think about mobile computing, right, mobile devices, they didn't have like a workshop about mobile devices, right? They looked at geolocation, they looked at mobile advertising, they looked at mobile device use by kids and mobile app development, right? But it wasn't like this huge sort of inchoate like let's go regulate mobile, because that wouldn't make any sense. And the same thing in the IoT. I think it would make a lot more sense to me if we all here came together in meetings like this and we talked about vehicular, or we talked more specifically about smart home or virtual assistants, or take any slice you like. You'll get better policy, certainly on the privacy side, because as Helen has taught us all, it's so contextual. That you'll get much better privacy policy if you focus more on the specific, as opposed to trying to say this shall be the policy for every device of X type that connects to the internet. And the other thing I would say, coming back to this, like the Internet of Things term, is that the separation that it implies is actually dangerous, because the whole history of the internet is sort of built on a series of assumptions about things that were never going to be connected to it, and actually now are. And even if the devices themselves aren't connected, the data will be connected, right? So you can believe an argument that says there's all these little devices out there, there's always going to be a gateway in front of them, they're never going to connect directly themselves, fine. But the data that they are producing will eventually get into the hands of some cloud provider or some other internet-connected entity. And so anyone who wants to tell you that you can sort of assume that this is a separate thing and that there's all these networks and they're never going to be connected to the internet, you should look back at the history of the whole internet and see how wrong that is. So just a little bit food for thought as we think about what to do next here. Thanks.
And the last speaker is Joe Calandrino from the FTC.
Hi there. So at the FTC, I'm with our Office of Technology Research and Investigation. So this is our fairly new unit, which handles it's disproportionately for the FTC full of technologists, and we do quite a bit of technical research and related things for the FTC. I'm fairly new to government. I've only been there for about 6 months at this point, so I still am somewhat bright-eyed and bushy-tailed about it all. And I have my 2 disclosures. Of course, my views are my own. They don't represent the commission or any specific commissioner. And the second disclosure, as I alluded to earlier, is that I'm not a lawyer. I'm actually a computer scientist. My background is in security and privacy. And this is a nice segue into my next point. I was actually working in an office probably about 30 feet away from here back when the iPhone was released. I remember the excitement out of myself and out of so many other people out of what that type of computing platform could do, and also as a security and privacy person, what this new use of this totally different type of technology from what many of us were using at that point in time could bring. There were going to be so many research papers written about this. It was going to be so great to have this as a researcher at that point. And I feel the same level of similarity when I hear about new uses or with new types of connected devices. I tend to slip into using IoT quite a bit just because it's used so often at this point. I'll probably end up going back and forth between the two, but I'll still avoid using the term cyber. I have some dignity. Just kidding. No, but Cora spoke earlier. Oh, yeah. But anyway, with Internet of Things, I tend to feel the same type of excitement when I notice a new type of device in a new area. It's both exciting to think about the possibilities and also interesting to think about how the new uses of it might come with their own security, privacy, and other challenges. Now, Cora already has spoken earlier from the FTC, and I'm not going to rehash her points, especially since, as not being a lawyer, I can't get into the enforcement aspects, for instance, as well as she would be able to. But instead, I'm going to speak a little bit about the research that we're conducting and workshops that we're performing before making an ask of people in this room. So, just going through a few of the workshops that we've had. About a year ago, we had a workshop on cross-device tracking. With that, we looked into things like the ability to actually connect activity across different devices, both from your phone to, say, your computer, but also potentially to your smart TV, to your Fitbit, to anything else that might be connected to the internet. Back in September, we had a ransomware workshop where we looked into things like not just whether or not ransomware might be targeting computers, which it is pretty heavily at this point, but also we've seen the emergence of ransomware that actually targets mobile devices. And there's been some collateral damage as a result of that to things like smart TVs that are based on those same platforms. We also have started to see at least demo versions of ransomware that would be applied to things like smart thermostats. And as the cartoon from this morning showed, there are a lot of other ways in which ransomware might end up popping up in different contexts. I'm very concerned that's going to show up on my smart broom at some point in the future. More recently, we've had a disclosures workshop where we've looked into various disclosures issues on devices. I think that is going to be a relevant issue here. There's a lot of complexity around it, as even was alluded to in the previous, or by our previous panelist. How exactly can you convey the right information, and in a context in which somebody might not have a screen? And in some cases, you might actually need to be able to convey some amount of information to an individual. So I see that as being another area where there's going to be a lot of thought in the future. Just last week, we had a workshop on drones. There's some debate over whether drones constitute IoT. Putting that aside for the moment, we actually looked at a variety of fairly low-priced drones, about $200 or below, typically marketed to hobbyists that provide their own Wi-Fi networks for connecting to the device and controlling the drone. Now, this is a pretty narrow sample. It's not representative of the entire space. But what we found was that these provided open networks that anybody could connect to. They often, or at least one of them provided Telnet without a password. Other ones did, in fact, provide Telnet. And you could potentially access the camera feed without authorization, or you could log in and disable a drone that somebody else was flying. In terms of things that we have coming up, we have a smart TV workshop coming up in December where we're going to be speaking more about smart TVs and privacy. And people have thoughts about that. I would encourage you to submit comments. We also have PrivacyCon where we've gotten submissions from the public, including people from this university, for our previous PrivacyCon, and we really are looking forward to that this year. And there's going to be more opportunities for research. So why am I spending all this time focusing on our research and on our events? Well, part of it is that I get this free press from this, but even beyond that, it's because of my earlier point about mobile. When you look at mobile devices, I think that most of us would conclude that they provide us tremendous benefits over the past decade, since we've seen the advent of these smart mobile devices. Now, this has been led to by amazing research that's facilitated all sorts of uses that we wouldn't have been able to think of even 10 years ago. And there have been quite a few just fantastic ideas for how to provide benefits to consumers. But there has also been quite a bit of great security and privacy research that's come out of this. How do you actually secure a device, particularly a platform that, say, might have limited battery life or other constraints that you encounter on mobile devices that you don't encounter on standard desktop computers quite as often, and that also has in some cases led to benefits for desktop computers. There's been quite a bit of research in terms of how do you ask for permission on a device, which has led to some really creative ways of asking for permission. We might not necessarily have perfect ways of doing it yet, but I think that there actually has been some progress based upon some of that research. We've had research into whether platforms can actually encourage better practices out of application developers that might be developing applications for the first time based upon this new type of platform. There's been research in terms of how to identify libraries that are out of date and even how to disclose information on a tiny screen. Now, this is an area in which researchers and technologists have made a big difference, and I think that within this new space, it's even richer. There are going to be a lot of great possibilities for use of these devices, including ways that we haven't even considered today. My suspicion is that the way in which IoT will end up making the biggest difference in my life 30 years from now will probably be something that nobody in this room is even thinking about today. That research is something that we strongly want to encourage. I also want to encourage research, though, around a number of hard problems that will require quite a bit of creativity from this community. For instance, how do you deal with things like the complicated notice and choice issues that you might encounter with these types of devices? How do you deal with things like the end-of-life, or with end-of-life issues, which we haven't really gotten into that heavily here, but what really should you do when a device reaches the end of its life? Do you have the device? There's been these ideas of failing dumb. There's been a lot of other ideas that have been thrown around about it, but what really should it be? And it probably is going to differ dramatically based upon the type of device. How can you help non-technical companies actually make good decisions when they're trying to develop these? What sorts of platforms can we provide? What sorts of choices can we help out with such that people actually are making decisions that provide the maximum possible security and privacy for users? How can people better understand how data about us is going to be used within these ecosystems? And even how can we protect against things like insecure devices that are within our own network? Or how can we deal with reuse of code that's going to be amongst many different devices? So you're going to see the same line of vulnerable code, both in potentially a vehicle and in your smart blender. And I think that there are a lot of areas for rich and challenging research. There are fascinating problems here, and it could lead to numerous PhDs. So if you want to make a big difference with your work, I think that there just is a ton of low-hanging fruit here. And if you're doing work in this area, please don't hesitate to reach out to us. My name is very lengthy, so I'm not going to ask you to email me directly, but if you email research@ftc.gov, we do actually read the research that's submitted to us. I can tell you that I've read through numerous papers that have been submitted, spent a considerable amount of time doing so, but we actually do try to check these things out. And this actually does make a difference to us. So if you're doing work in this area, we would love to hear from you.
So, questions? Yes, ma'am.
I love the presentations, but this question is probably specifically to Keith, and it's about your ankle biters. Because Nick Feenstra and I were trying to conduct a study of the technology that could potentially have some significant policy ramification. And although we wanted to do it in the mobile arena, we wound up having tremendous difficulty doing it because basically the data flows we were blinded to it. And it would have been much easier to do it in a web environment. And I think that that's part of what you're saying, that we cut off the potential for these ankle biters to do some of the really important work because question is a little bit sort of, was the internet and the web a historical exception that it came to us open in the way that it did, that enabled so much, and I think Arben's work is a lot in this vein as well, or is what we're experiencing today with the closed systems and the inability, the standard to which we have to find our way?
The question is, is the historically open nature of the internet or interoperable nature of the internet a historical exception, or not? Is that the question?
Yeah, will the ankle biters have a role to play?
Will ankle biters have a role to play? Well, I'm hopeful. I'm not a historian. I'm not sure I'm any more qualified than my co-panelist to answer your question. I think if you look at real history, interoperability generally happens in times of stress, when people have to work together. So, we've had many interoperable standards in the world. Gold was a standard for the exchange of wealth. The gauge of roads has been a standard since the Roman Empire. We've had interoperable railroad systems, since people wanted to cross different places. We've had interoperable standard time zones because of the railroads. So I think that the notion of competitors cooperating to produce interoperable standards is not one. There's a long history behind that. Even the Soviet Union built a space shuttle that was very compatible with our space shuttle. So there's a long history of sort of interoperability. I don't think the internet is an anomaly in that sense, but I think when there's less stress and less need to cooperate, of course companies naturally want to control as much as they can. So if there is going to be an alphabet empire and an Apple empire, and they each think that they might be able to win the whole ball game, they have less of a need to cooperate with competitors. Google now controls the phone and the software running on the phone and the server, and they now have their own cellular provider, Project Fi. So to the extent that companies can build these sorts of vertically integrated empires, there may be less of a need for interoperability. But I certainly don't think the notion of competitors having interoperability is an anomaly. I think it goes way back.
Just to add on to that a little bit, which I agree with, I think even if you look just at the history of the internet, it's not, it kind of goes back and forth. So if you look at what's going on right now with routing and orchestration and management of networking, it's gotten completely blown up from what used to be very closed systems to now where you have open source implementations, you have much greater access to the global routing tables and so on. If you think about internet access itself, started out as a fairly closed system, right? Anybody who remembers CompuServe and Prodigy and AOL, right? Like those were the gatekeepers to the network, and now it's more open, right? So I don't think it's kind of like at different sections of the network, at different parts of the stack, it has gone from one direction to the other. But I don't think it's all going in one direction necessarily. I also think, this has sort of been an undercurrent of the discussion today, but hasn't formally been vocalized. People talk a little bit about the lack of standardization in IoT and the kind of, you talked about the fragmented nature of the market. Sometimes that's just how it looks at the beginning, and eventually it turns out that having interoperability looks very attractive to the players later on, even though at the beginning you have all these disparate systems that don't interoperate with each other. So I think that's like a very possible future for IoT. We just don't know yet because it's early.
So can I add? So one thing I actually wanted to add is this notion of blinding and making the flows blind. I actually think that there's maybe sort of two intents here, right, that are getting conflated. One is, people are arguing for end-to-end encryption because they want to actually protect against the ISPs and nation states snooping on you, and that seems like a good thing to have, right? And the other reason seems to be that actually we want to prevent our competitors or somebody else from reverse engineering our APIs. And somehow I think we're sort of conflating these intents, and we have one hammer called TLS or one hammer called end-to-end encryption, and we're actually using that for two different intents. And maybe it makes sense to sort of not conflate those two intents, right? So it seems like end-to-end encryption is a good thing because you actually want to protect against the big brother nation state. On the other hand, it also sort of prevents the ankle biters from reverse engineering and hacking a system. And maybe things like rotate and release, that's one step towards sort of breaking the tie and sort of breaking those two intents. You still get the end-to-end encryption, but you don't quite have you still enable sort of some amount of data flow processing over it.
Next, yes. Yes, in the black.
So you were saying before that the network will save us. So I'm an internet too, and we have this research and education network, and we're actually have a call for papers out on what the next generation needs to be of this research and education network that Princeton and CMU and Stanford and y'all are involved in. So first of all, I'm going to send you guys the call for papers so that you can send in what you think is needed to be able to create the internet of the future. And I'd like to know what thoughts you have now, since you said the network will save us, because I think the network is a piece of the puzzle.
Of course.
But I also think it's end-to-end, hardware, firmware, software, service level, and at the insulin pump, maybe not like Fitbit, but at the right devices, and then data rest, data in motion, storage cloud, blah, blah, like the works, right? Key pairs encryption, design it the right way and execute it to make it secure. So what are you thinking on the network side?
So I think again, you're right that the network is a piece of the puzzle. I think where the network can particularly help is in sort of dealing with legacy infrastructures or infrastructures that are fundamentally unfixable, right? So the network is going to help you in maybe adding like new types of intrusion detection or firewalling capabilities that can protect against attacks that are well known. Like, okay, the telnet against the drone that's already there. You can say, okay, like just block telnet. Even if the device manufacturer or the vendor was dumb, the network could step in and say, okay, look, we can prevent these dumb things from happening.
So do you have some smart ideas on what the network, like is it a separate wave, is it network segmentation, is it software-defined perimeter, is it, do you have ideas, or you just say expect?
Yes, it's all of the above. I mean, in some sense, it has to be some combination of all of the above, right? I think it has to be some notion of a software-defined perimeter, and that's where like some of these new open things like SDN, NFV are actually really helpful. So going back to your second question on like what the future sort of internet might want to look like, and this is actually something that echoes the sentiments of maybe many people in this room, that we've actually been lamenting sort of this, going back to this ankle biter, right? If you also want to be ankle biters on the internet as well, and change routing, change deployment, have like more dynamic control. Internet started off as the grand goal of enabling it, but now it's become a production network where we can actually not do anything as researchers, right? And that's totally fair. That's where it's evolved to. So that might be something to think about in terms of a future internet that constantly enables the ankle biters like Keith and me to go and Nick to go and say, let's muck around, break a few things, and then see what happens. And that's something, the internet started off that way, but it sort of lost it along the path. And maybe thinking about like how do we enable it without totally breaking it would be nice to do. Your thoughts?
Questions? Yeah, I'll have one. One of the things we're studying in systemic risk is modularity. And modularity is one of the classic design features in order to avoid cascades, in order to avoid contagion. You can call it modularity, you can call it quarantine, whatever. It seems to me that the IoT and a little bit of modularity is not a bad thing. The IoT is almost getting rid of any possibility of policy modularity or everything is connected in so many ways that it makes any small incident immediately contagious and leads to a catastrophic cascade. And I realize there's all sorts of economies of scales and all sorts of efficiencies associated with the absence of modularity, but shouldn't we retain some? So if the electricity goes out, I can still open my door, or whatever version of that you want to use.
Yeah. Well, sorry, do you want to go? Go. I mean, I think often we build these systems so that security is only as strong as the weakest link, or robustness is only as strong as the weakest link. And I think there are other ways to architect, the modular structure so that security can be as strong as the strongest link. You can have things in series instead of in parallel, and that things could be robust as long as at least one system is working. I still have in the back of my car, I keep like 10 gallons of water, and it's a 2003 car, and I still remember how to drive to less earthquake-prone territory. So I think, even if all my systems get hacked into, I still have a safety valve. I think that's important to have.
Right.
And we also have seen some push already in this direction. For instance, the idea of network segmentation, the idea that you have some sort of a weak device within your network, like some really old connected camera or something else that's wildly insecure, and they can use that to hop into your network and then get access to customer data within a business, is something that would be strongly discouraged and would be a pretty terrible practice. So,
Yeah. Right.
Yeah, and the only other thing I was going to say is that, even when we see these really large-scale attacks, right, Brian Krebs' website came down. I'm very sorry about that. I think it's very unfortunate, but most people on the internet noticed nothing at all. And that's because the internet is incredibly decentralized, and you can have these like very large scale attacks that affect one corner, but do not actually poison the entire network or bring the whole network down. And that's a really important feature to, I think, continue to shore up going forward as you have more and more devices connecting.
Yeah. So actually, so I think modularity is absolutely something we need to build in, and I think that's why I was thinking about like these two pieces, right? I think one is the enforcement engine that actually enables the modularity and builds in the right defenses and defenses in depth. And also on the other hand, we also need research, and I think we need people from the policy, from machine learning, from whatever area that is, to actually understand the threat landscape, right? To understand where the enforcement should be, what the enforcement should be, we actually need to model the threats and say, if this happens, this is going to create this cascades of stuff. And that's actually a very, very complex problem. How do you actually understand the attack surface or the attack graph of, oh, if I got into this webcam, and then I can actually get into some other high priority asset. And we need mechanisms to model that and frame the problem in that way.
Yes, sir.
Keith, you talked about the ankle biting thing with the trying to get into the building at MIT. And then the last slide you showed was the electronic voting machine and the question of hacking into that. The question I have is that these systems have a proprietary right and protection of what they have. So, for example, the company that makes the voting machine, how is it possible to know if they've made the appropriate changes to ensure that what Ed found can't be done without having an independent source had the capacity to review the machine? Now, Princeton got the machine through a second level, but there was serious legal questions as to whether that was conspiracy to join into the possession of stolen property. What is the issue? How is it being addressed to know that, I think there's something like 530 voting districts in the United States, some very, and we don't know how many are electric, we don't know if they all have compatible equipment. What is your status now in thinking about the entire problem?
Well, I talked about the need for sort of auditing, where you could have a device, it does its thing, but we want to be able to have a competing device come in and audit that the first device is doing its job correctly. I think that's kind of a healthy notion. We have this with publicly traded companies. We trust that Apple is honest, but we sort of trust but verify. There's an independent auditor that checks Apple's financial results. In the case of the voting, there's a few ways you can do it. There are actually some genius schemes. My colleague Benedita, who is at MIT, did an amazing thesis, other people worked on this too, on publicly verifiable voting, where you actually don't need to trust the device at all. The individual voter goes home with a little receipt with a barcode, and later when the votes are cast and they announce the new president is whoever, they also publish a certificate, and you can check your own receipt against the certificate and make sure that your vote was counted. And that means if a voter can produce a certificate that's not in the public vote count, you can see that someone screwed up and they got to fix it. So it's sort of you can publicly prove that either the public vote count includes your vote or it doesn't include your vote without needing to trust the machine or any audit of the machine. So these kinds of amazing things are mathematically possible, and we should maybe use them for that kind of high stakes thing. Historically, voting has not been thought of as a high-stakes application of computer technology. We have nuclear reactors here, and then we have the light bulbs, and then we have the forks, and then we've had the voting machines. So we might need to recategorize.
Actually, just adding one thing to that from my time doing a lot of elections-related work, you might want to also check out verified voting, which does actually maintain a list of what voting machines are used where, so you can see, for instance, what precincts use optical scan machines and so on. So that could be a good source for one of your questions.
So I think just to add to that, another sort of maybe a part of your question was, is it possible to audit or verify that this machine is safe without actually breaking the law or breaking into it in some way? And I think there are actually very cool sort of programming language techniques, and Ben can probably talk more about that. Things like proof carrying code and so on, which actually you can build safe systems from the ground up that actually don't have these kinds of vulnerabilities. So it is possible to build those systems with those kinds of safety properties from the ground up. It so happens that those voting machines did not have them, and a lot of the bugs that Ed and his team found were actually very, very basic buffer overflow vulnerabilities, which are like known in the security community for the longest time.
But it is your assumption then that we should assume that the upcoming election, that the machines
Are fixed?
are good or bad?
As a government employee on the clock, I have no opinion.
This is just a quick comment. Just the irony of the fact that you're talking about the robustness of the internet and that we still don't have Twitter or PayPal or anything right now because one company died as under
Yep.
attack.
Yep.
This is,
It's still, I mean, so I think it's one of these sort of principles of fate sharing, and it is still somewhat robust in the sense that you can still access Google, you can access Gmail, and so on. I think that's kind of what I think that's what Alyssa was getting to, right? But it is true that I think there are many parts of the internet that are totally broken. DNS is famously broken. DOS defense is famously broken. I think, and that's kind of where we need sort of new research infrastructures where we can test out these things like new generations of DNS technologies or new generations of DDoS defense. That's actually hard for researchers to test out in the real world. Even if you have come up with a cool idea, we can't actually test it out at scale. So it cuts both ways, right? It is in fact evidence that it is somewhat decentralized by design. It is also pointing out that many protocols we rely on are fundamentally broken and can be easily attacked.
But could also be replaced, like the
Yeah.
DNS. We don't need it, right? We just use it as a convenience. So enough of these bad incidents and it will get replaced.
Yes, Nick.
So I have a question about Joe mentioned microsegmentation, yes, you were also talking about firewalling.
Yeah.
I mean, that makes sense to you and me and Keith, Joe, I guess, as well.
Yeah.
But like the average user, I mean, typically when you talk about those kinds of things, outside of computer science or even networking,
Sure.
people are like, no way, I don't want to configure a firewall.
Yeah.
As you get more and more modules and devices, already people just wanted to they basically want it to work, they want it to be secure, they don't want it to ever touch a rule. So what do you do about that? Is that a user interface problem? Is it a machine learning problem? How do you think it should be solved?
That's a fantastic question. I think the question is about we may have the networking solutions, but they may not get deployed because people don't want to think about the complexity of implementing these. I think this gets back to something that I think Alyssa had mentioned about. It doesn't make sense to think of these solutions in the abstract in terms of IoT or something. I think it makes sense to think about particular market verticals and how particular market verticals operationalize these things. Right? For example, if you think about enterprises versus home customers, are going to be totally different. Right? Enterprises have an IT team, have an IT management team that are actually managing firewalls and actually actively manipulating rules and so on. Similarly, if you're thinking about industrial control or grid systems, they have security teams that are on site that are actually doing these things, right? So in those scenarios, it might be an easier sort of sell, and it actually might make a lot more sense because they have a lot more at stake. Talking to a lot of people, it seems like people have largely given up on the consumer market, or the individual market, sorry. Either because people don't seem to put a price on the security and privacy from most studies, seem to suggest that, which is kind of sad. And also that they somehow expect that somebody else is in charge, like the Google or the ISP or the Comcast is in charge of the security and privacy. So it might in fact make more sense to say, look, let's start by trying to go to a market vertical where we have a great threat and we can have actual impact. And then hopefully things start percolating into the consumer individual segment. That's the sense I get from talking to people. It's like, they're like, okay, it's very, very hard to get individuals to pay for security and privacy features. And maybe that's a part of like user education or awareness, that's a broader question that we need to sort of handle here.
One thing that I think that I appreciated before even coming to my current job, but now appreciate even more so, is just the importance of usable privacy and security. So if people are doing work in that area, that's something that I would certainly strongly encourage, because it's really important to make sure that all this progress that we're making can actually be used by consumers.
Alyssa, I had a question for you. I mean, what is the pro answer that Cisco would give? If I'm a hospital and my mammogram vendor is telling me to hook that up to the internet so that the photos can be uploaded immediately to someone's electronic health record, but I read somewhere that maybe I shouldn't just hook things up without talking to Cisco. Is the answer you're going to be able to give the hospital going to be better in 5 years than today, or is it the same, or what do we have to look forward to?
So I think, yeah, good question. So at present we are focusing on not on regulated markets, first of all, but that's for a reason, right? Because as we look at enterprise versus consumer, enterprise just has so many advantages, right? As he said, not only do you have the team of people, but they are incented to put the time in to configure the network appropriately. We are incented to make it much easier to configure because we're competing with other vendors on the ease of that installation and the management. There's also been a fairly significant revolution just in the management interfaces and making all of that easier for IT administrators. So I think in the enterprise market, the market forces are very likely to sort of drive this in a good direction more quickly because everyone's incentives are aligned, as opposed to in consumer where, and also the other thing is that we can charge more, right? Because people have bigger checkbooks, and so we're not constrained by, oh well, this chip only costs us 50 cents or $1, and so we are going to scrape as close as possible to that margin. We have a lot more flexibility because these customers are already paying us a lot of money to be a hands-on vendor and to set up not just their network but their phones and their telepresence units and their lights and their heating systems and everything else. So I just think it's a much easier path for us, and so you're likely to see advancement a lot more quickly than you are in the consumer market.
Yes, sir.
So one of the recurring themes today has been the need for who mines the miners and several degrees back. How do you verify that the keys can change or whatever? Is there a model you see, clearly, with all due respect, I don't see NTIA or FTC playing that role. You probably don't want the same companies that are collecting the data to do. So is there a model you see for who can do that? All I can come up with is like consumers reports test tires, but that's kind of a different thing. In the government contracts context, you have companies that are seated contractors, so they're not actually competing for the work. They're writing the proposal, the RFPs, and checking to make sure that the companies that have the contracts are doing the work. But who can we trust in this environment?
I think the model the only thing we've done in the past is the present free-for-all, which is that if you look at the CVE list, which is a sort of government-curated list of vulnerabilities, most of them come from, I'm not going to say random people, but essentially random people, random ankle biters, but often they're employed by competitors. So, I mean, Google employs a guy named Tavis Ormandy, whose job is just to find bugs. He may find them in Google products, but maybe he doesn't announce those. But when he finds them in Microsoft products, boom, he announces them. Microsoft hates this guy, and he works for their competitor. Microsoft, I'm sure, has people looking for bugs in Google products, and they get the CVE. I mean, this is not a crazy model. To the extent that ankle biters have the tools so that a diligent ankle biter can find a bug in a competitor's product, it does make everybody better, and that's kind of how we've done things to date.
Yeah. So just as a point, right? I think the people. I think there's a lot of people incentivized to go find these hacks for many reasons. Sometimes there's bug bounties that actually give them money. Sometimes it's just like publicity. Sometimes it's public service. I think there's a lot of ankle biters out there. Sometimes ankle biters get hired by the companies. Right? All the people who did the famous car hacks on the highway, I think they now work for Uber, security, and so on. So it's clear there's also like a market force that drives people to do this. It's possible. I mean, I think. The government or academia or somebody the government can nudge and say, okay, we need to have this publicly disclosed. But you're right, I think it's probably going to be some sort of a ground up effort and a bottom up effort from researchers, ankle biters, whoever, to do that.
Just a really quick reply to that specific comment. NTIA is also working on another multi-stakeholder process on cybersecurity vulnerability disclosure, getting security researchers and companies in the room to talk about how to do vulnerability disclosure without getting lawyers involved. And a number of the companies that are further along with this, like Microsoft, like Google, have those resources or those avenues already available, but new companies that are coming in don't necessarily. So that is actually something exactly that we're doing, where we're trying to nudge people along to have those processes for the ankle biters to be able to do their work without fear of legal repercussions.
I mean, my understanding is that the Russian government and the Chinese government and the Israeli government and the French government and our government all pay very generously to the ankle biters who discover these things and don't disclose them to the manufacturers. So for all the rest of us, the good guys, it's in our interest to make it at least as generous to be an ankle biter for good than to be an ankle biter who sells it to whichever government is the highest bidder.
So if nothing else, the ankle biter has entered our lexicon today.
Just one kind of follow-up note on that, because at least from the Cisco point of view, I would say it's not the case that everything that the FTC does and the European regulators do and the attention that NTIA is giving to these problems is just like, oh, it's like, well, we'll end up with a $30 million fine, like we don't care, right? Every single time that we get called out for some practice that people don't like in the press, it goes straight to the top of the company, and those kinds of incidents we work very, very hard to try to avoid. And so that might not surface because the only stories that you read about things that companies are doing in this space are the bad stories and not the good stories. But I think it would be a mistake to think that there's that doesn't create any work on the inside by people who are trying to put a lot of thought into the design of the products, trying to suss out vulnerabilities before the products get deployed. Like every single time one of those things happens, it's a really, really big deal internally. And so I just think it's important to realize that because it's really not visible to anyone. But it's also really hard. So this morning I think Cora was talking about have reasonable practices. Like, what does that mean, right? Like, every single day in my job, I have to decide, like, what's reasonable today, right? And there's no good definition for a lot of these things. There's no good framework to guide, like, minute design decisions in these various products. That doesn't mean that people aren't trying to make those decisions correctly, but it just doesn't get a lot of visibility.
Yes, ma'am. This should be our last question because we've hit the...
It's a quick call, it's a quick follow-up from Keith's question. That how will governments respond if companies start competing with them? So if Cisco started offering a bigger bounty than the U.S. government, and probably the U.S. government would love it if they offer a bigger bounty than the Chinese government. So how will they feel if they start competing for the ankle biters' money, exemption, whatever?
Like, so unqualified to answer this question. So I think we are very interested in shoring up the vulnerabilities equities process, right? To us, that is a very important component of a solution here. A bidding war for vulnerabilities is basically the last thing that we would want, right? And so I think, putting our efforts towards trying to solidify that process, making it more transparent so that we all don't find out about these things after the fact is probably the most important thing we can do going forward.
And with that, thank you to everybody, and good night.
So thank you very much. I think this is our last panel, so we're closing. Again, I just want to thank Joanna, Jean, and Laura all for their, and Patty Yelovich also for their help in organizing the day today. So thank you very much for that. And I wanted to also let people know there's a reception in the back of the room for continued discussions. And I just wanted to thank this last set of panelists. Just closing thoughts. I really liked this last panel. It was very positive, forward-looking, lots of solutions. Maybe a couple in there we could pull out. But seriously, I think some of the things I heard, I think I really might be some interesting directions forward. I think in particular, Alyssa's comments about thinking about the IoT not just as this one monolithic thing, but as a lot of sub-problems. And I think we heard a lot of those sub-problems, maybe not a lot of answers yet, but certainly related to vulnerability disclosure, notice and choice, usable interfaces, et cetera. A lot of interesting ideas in all the panels, but particularly in what we just heard. So a big thank you again to last panel and all of our panelists today. So thank you very much.